afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Jennifer Victor, and I want to thank everyone for pivoting at the last minute to this Zoom presentation of a panel of experts that we have at the Schar School here, so somewhat hastily thrown together in response to sort of really important emergency kind of things going on in federal government that are making a lot of people uneasy and raising a lot of questions. And at the Schar School, we like to offer as many opportunities as we can to allow people to access the experts and present opportunities for all of us to come together and address things that on which we have some expertise. So as people are taking their seats, so to speak, and we've got people filing in, we've already got about 75 people participating. So this is terrific turnout on what's turning out to be a bit of a snowy day. The chat is just a couple of ground rules, and then I'll launch in to tell you how things are going to go. We've got the chat is open, but it's going to be largely unmonitored by the panelists. If you want to use it for your own other purposes, that is okay, but don't expect much response there. But there's also a Q&A function that you can access from the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if, as the panelists are talking, you'd like to ask questions, please go ahead and use that Q&A function. Faculty may respond by writing, or we may flag them to respond verbally later. But we're going to spend the first 45 minutes or to an hour with our own little presentations and discussion among us. And then starting around 4 o'clock-ish, we'll launch to audience Q&A for approximately 30 minutes. And that is the plan. So let me start. I'm Jennifer Victor. I'm faculty here in the Schar School. I'm an associate professor of political science. My area's expertise is in American politics and specifically the US Congress. With us today on the panel, we also have Professor Eric McGlinchey, an associate professor specializing in the politics of Central Asia. He's the director of the Undergraduate International Relations Policy Task Force. He is the author of Chaos, Violence, Dynasty, Politics and Islam in Central Asia, and his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the US State Department, and many other agencies. Professor Rob McGrath is an associate professor in the Schar School specializing in US politics, state legislative politics, and quantitative political methodology. He's a former recipient of the Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellowship, and his research has been published in more than a dozen high-ranking academic journals. Chris Burke is an assistant professor in the Schar School specializing in law, politics, and the philosophy of punishment. His 2003 book, Democracy in Captivity: Prisoners, Patience, and the Limits of Self-Government, explores pathologies associated with crime and captivity. His work has been published in the journals Law and Social Inquiry and Critical Inquiry. That's a really hard word for me to say. Professor Char Miller is an associate professor in the Schar School specializing in political theory, particularly sovereignty and political aesthetics. His 2009 book, Cities on the Plains, examines the roles of violence in consolidating political communities. His research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Annenberg Foundation. And finally, Steve Pearlstein is a journalist by trade and the Robinson Professor of Public Affairs here at George Mason University and a Schar School faculty. He was the founding editor of the Boston Observer and served as a reporter in economics, defense, and Canadian politics for the Washington Post for many years. He became an opinion writer for the Post in 2003 and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for commentary about the economic crisis in housing and financial products that year. Most recently, he is the author of the best-selling 2004 book, Moral Capitalism: Why Fairness Won't Make Us Poor. I'm really pleased to be joined by so many of my really esteemed colleagues, and I'm very happy that we could all come together to bring our various sources of expertise and so forth to this panel. Before we get started, I also want to give a gigantic moment of gratitude to Amberly Page, who is an administrator in the Schar School, who's been absolutely supportive and instrumental in pulling this program together and helping us to pivot to Zoom, as well as Shannon Williams, who also is pitching in at the last minute to administer this program in this format. So thank you so much to the school for supporting us. All right, so now to the substance of things. Our format here is I'm going to have each of the panelists, starting with myself, talk for 5 to 7 minutes, talking about what's going on in the world. And I'm going to set the stage by sort of relaying some historical context, theoretical context, and an accounting of what has happened so far. And then have my colleagues follow up with their areas of expertise to offer their perspectives. While I'm talking again, just to remind those who may have just come in, the chat is open but largely unmonitored. I do ask, since some of the topics we're talking about today are can be disturbing, they can be upsetting to people. There may be some emotions going on. That if you're using the chat, if you're using the Q&A, when we turn on the mics later, please just follow. This is a classroom, essentially, and so please just follow the traditional rules of civility and mutual respect. And I thank you for that. I do, once again, encourage everybody to use the Q&A as people are talking if questions come up while people are speaking, and then we will get to those. All right, so now with the substance. We might get into the weeds on a few important policies here today. But the point of today's panel is not to debate the merits of changes to policy so much. Rather, the focus of this event is to discuss the ramifications of the processes by which these changes are occurring, and the consequences of them. So in the most basic sense, just to take a step back to fundamentals, democracies are built on 4 basic principles: free and fair elections, voting rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law. All 4 of these basic foundations are currently under threat in the United States, and arguably have been for a long time. Political scientists have been writing about threats to democracy and democratic decline in the United States for at least a decade, shouting out various warning signs that we've seen from other countries that started showing up here. Just yesterday, or maybe it was today, some political scientists writing in the journal Foreign Affairs, which I may link later, they argue that the US is moving toward what we call a system of competitive authoritarianism. So this suggests that the United States would no longer be classified as a democracy because these 4 basic fundamentals have been so eroded, and instead would get classified as a competitive authoritarian state. In a competitive authoritarian state, political opponents may compete for power. You still have elections, you still have contest, but there is an unfair setting where one side of the political of the adversaries, one side essentially has consolidated power and profoundly restricts the opposition in a way that makes the competition unfair. So legislative, executive, and judicial, these, elementary students of government know that the separation of powers and checks and balances across the 3 branches of government are foundational to the US system. Congress makes the laws, the executive executes the laws, and the judiciary settles disputes about law. To be clear, much of the activity happening in the executive branch today is against the law. Because the policies are being enacted outside of the consideration of the lawmaking branch. So if we go back to those fundamentals, free and fair elections, we already know that Donald Trump claimed the 2020 election was stolen, refused to concede, and did not engage in a peaceful transition of power. So that is one example of a blight on that principle. Voting rights. We've seen voter roll purges and efforts not to count legally cast ballots, particularly been watching the case of an elected judge in North Carolina, where there's been court battles over counting legal ballots in that case. That's not yet resolved. Civil liberties, we've seen restrictions on words from government employees in terms of what words federal employees can use, all of which are related to identity, with the notable exception of those for male and white. So these are sort of ideological restrictions on basic freedom of speech. So that's concerning for civil liberties. And rule of law is where I think we're going to spend a lot of time today. Only Congress has the power to appropriate funds. The executive cannot constitutionally restrict or reallocate what Congress has appropriated. Congress even clarified rules about that back in the 1970s after the Watergate scandal, where the executive crafts policy beyond what Congress has put into statute, and where the executive ignores judicial action. The rule of law is is under threat. And it's the breakdown of those things that lead the political scientists to raise this, what should be an alarm about the change of regime status in the United States. A little bit of historical context here, I think, is useful on the American politics side. A lot of what we've seen has been done in the name of government efficiency. We've seen lots of efforts through different presidential administrations in US history towards trying to improve government efficiency. Most notably back in the 1990s in the Bill Clinton administration, Vice President Al Gore led a group called National Partners for Reinventing Government. The acronym was NPR, believe it or not. The initiative was aimed at streamlining government processes, reducing the size of federal bureaucracy, and facilitating innovations. Should sound familiar. It's very similar to the charge given by a different entity today. But back then in the 90s, over the course of 5 years, when this group, the NPR group, was in power and doing its work, they eliminated 100 different government programs, 250,000 federal jobs. It consolidated more than 800 federal agencies. So it did have real impact over the course of 5 years. The agencies that were most heavily targeted included departments of agriculture, interior, health and human services, labor, housing and urban development, and notably the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Initially, that NPR in the 90s claimed that it would produce more than $108 billion in savings, which at the time represented about 7% of federal outlays. However, many of the proposed reductions that came out of their initial report required congressional approval, and Congress did not approve them. They were rejected by lawmakers. Ultimately, Congress passed several laws implementing some of the NPR recommendations, and the total savings to the federal government turned out to be around $58 billion, or about half of what had been initially proposed. Okay, so that's some context to how this had worked at one point in the not too distant past. Today, the United States has a new effort to supposedly streamline the government, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. This unit, created by executive order, is not a federal agency or department. It is not led by the vice president, but by Elon Musk, an unelected political ally of the president who has neither received Senate consent nor security vetting. In its series of robust and rapid initial actions over the past few weeks, the DOGE reveals itself not to be an agent of government efficiency. Rather, it appears to be aimed at consolidating power in the executive branch by removing neutral or oppositional civil servants and subverting the policymaking apparatus outlined in the Constitution. Let me summarize some of its actions, and then I'll turn to my colleagues. But this is going to take a minute. In 3 weeks, the DOGE has directed the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, to offer a deferred resignation program to all federal employees, using the same email subject line as the one Musk used when he purchased Twitter and significantly cut its staff, just to be sure everyone knew who the directing order was coming from. That order is still under court challenge, as are many of what I'm about to describe. DOGE employees have been exempt from federal laws requiring disclosure and documentation. We have seen the removal and replacing of federal employees who are typically treated as apolitical. For example, we've seen 17 solicitors general be asked to leave their jobs. We've seen purges at both the FBI and the DOJ. And notably for the Mason community, the Archivist of the United States, a former Mason faculty member, has been removed. These apolitical jobs removals have been reported by the Washington Post and The Hill. We've seen accounts that the team of people engaged in these actions by DOGE have not been vetted, have not had background checks, or been hired through standard federal government practices aimed at preventing corruption and ensuring security. We've also seen forced deportation of thousands of people in the United States without due process and relocation into tent camps at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, a government-controlled space that has conveniently ambiguous legal jurisdiction. I talked earlier about banned words. We've also seen government websites deleted. Those have been reported by Yahoo News and Washington Post. Okay, now we've seen also, I'm going to give you a list of places that various news agencies, and I'll tell you where the reporting is coming from, at least one of the places the reporting comes from, where DOGE members have been reportedly affecting the systems, changing what's going on behind the scenes within these various agencies. at the Office of Management and Budget, according to the New Republic, at the Treasury Department, according to the New York Times, at the Office of Personnel Management, according to Reuters, at USAID, according to Washington Post, at the General Services Administration, according to Wired, at the Bureau of Fiscal Services, according to the New York Times, at the Centers for Disease Control, according to the Washington Post, at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, according to the Wall Street Journal, at the Department of Energy, according to CNN, at the Department of Health and Human Services, according to the Washington Post, at the Department of Veterans Affairs, according to military.com, at the Federal Aviation Administration, according to Gizmodo, at the National Nuclear Security Administration, according to Microsoft News Network, at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, according to The Guardian, at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, according to Axios, at the National Science Foundation, according to Politico, at the Department of Education, according to The Hill, at the National Institutes of Health, according to NPR, at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, according to Bloomberg, at the Environmental Protection Agency, according to Politico, at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, according to Washington Post, at the Department of Labor, according to the Washington Post, and at the Social Security Administration, according to Semaphore. Congress has remained largely silent on the variety of actions that all of this has gone on in the last 3 weeks. It's been very rapid, and the overwhelming nature of these significant changes appears to be part of a political strategy about consolidating power and preventing opposition. The breakdown of the rule of law, where Congress is becoming silent about this, degrades democracy, and the other branches failing to check is sealing the fate of the degradation of the American state of democracy. This is sort of out of a dictator's playbook. We have seen very, very similar events occur in El Salvador under Bukele, in Venezuela under Chavez. In modern day, we've seen it in Viktor Orban's Hungary, in Modi's India, in Turkey under Erdogan. And what we see is this purge of professional civil servants in order to replace civil servants with loyalists, or to degrade the services that the government is able to provide in order to stymie opposition. So this is the state of things of where we are. The fact that this all has happened so rapidly has raised a lot of alarm with a lot of people. And it's very clear, I hope at this point, that this is not just about making efficiencies, improvements in government. With that being said, I am now going to turn this to the rest of my panelists to offer further context on areas of their expertise. And I'm going to start with Professor McGlinchey. Eric, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Victor, for that incredible overview. First, I realize that there may be some civil servants in the audience, and I'd like to begin by simply thanking you for the work that you've done. I've had the good fortune to work with many people at USAID, Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and the State Department over the past 2 decades since being here in DC. I know this is a hard time. I also know the dedication that you put into your work and how particularly challenging this must be given the effort that you put in for the past 2 decades. So maybe small consolation, but again, I just want to say thank you for everything that you have done for those of you in the audience who are facing this challenge directly with the government. So what I'd like to do 3 things. I'd like to start with an event that I think captures the central USAID mission, or like one of the main missions of USAID, particularly since 9/11, which is countering violent extremism internationally, and briefly discuss why this mission may seem so remote to many Americans. Main point here is that, when put in context of the challenges of American daily life, what USAID is doing internationally, one can understand why this might be one of the first things to be put on the cutting block with the new Trump administration. The second thing I'd like to do is present what I think is an alternative reason for why USAID was the first major agency to get cut in the new administration, one that really hasn't been talked about too much in the press. And the main point that I want to get across here is that USAID's mission has become increasingly more difficult since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And because it's become more complex, it's become harder and harder for the US political parties and the US population to rally behind USAID, despite the fact that what USAID is doing is it remains critically important. And the last thing I'd like to do is conclude with the potential implications of what the end of USAID may mean for US foreign policy and for US fortunes globally. So let me begin with this story. It's one that comes from a region that I do my research in, which is Central Asia. But also affects us locally here in DC because the people affected were local DC residents. So in July 2018, two Washington, D.C. residents, Jay Austin and Lauren Gogan, were killed by ISIS militants in Tajikistan. So Jay and Lauren were two among four cyclists who were killed in Tajikistan that day. And since September 2001, hundreds more have been killed by violent extremists globally, not just in Central Asia, but across the world. And this is a headline that may come across in the paper. We might read about it and might move on. And I think moving on is understandable when we look at the challenges that Americans everywhere are facing. We've got inflation, we've got unaffordable housing, childcare, higher education is so remote for most people, uh, inadequate healthcare. So most Americans have little time to follow what USAID is doing in places like Tajikistan. These efforts to counter violent extremism, it seems so distant from the daily reality that one can understand why, when faced with things like gun violence and the opioid epidemic, the loss of manufacturing jobs, one can understand why people might actually understand or gravitate to this claim by Trump that USAID is, quote, a tremendous fraud. Why should we be supporting international societies when our own local economies are stalled? Again, I think it's understandable. I think what's less been talked about in the press is this idea that that the mission of USAID may be part of the problem, the complexity of this mission, and why, in Elon Musk's terms, why USAID should be the first one to go into the wood chipper. So initially, in the 1960s, USAID was started as a way to contain the Soviet Union. This was something that all parties in the United States could rally behind. And the idea was that supporting international development would be the best way and the most cost-effective way of containing the USSR. The collapse of the USSR made things a lot more difficult. Initially, the US pivoted to this idea that, oh, we're in the end of history, that democracy was going to be triumphant. So USAID pivoted from containing communism to promoting democracy. And for the 1990s, that seemed to work pretty well, although the spread of democracy was slow and sometimes imperfect. Things got upended in September of 2001, 9/11, when we quickly discovered that there was a much greater threat out there, that this challenge of militant Islam was threatening the political order. So we've learned quickly that militancy, and just not just militant Islam, but all kinds of militancy thrive in places where there's state collapse and state weakness. So places like Tajikistan, where I study, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, these are places that are conducive to the rise of all kinds of different militant ideas. And what USAID has argued, and what they've done, I think, quite effectively, is they've tried to address those areas that are conducive to state collapse. So they've tried to step in when there's hunger, so providing food aid, health aid, civil society promotion. They've worked on job creation. And I've watched very closely in Central Asia the thousands and thousands of efforts and the many, many different programs to counter violent extremism in local communities. But clearly not everything has worked, right? So we've seen we see many incidents of violent extremism, many of them actually conducted by people, people from the area that I study, Central Asia. So we saw the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, the New York City truck attack in 2017. There's been attacks in Istanbul, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Stockholm. Many of these efforts, just from this one region that I study, seem like a failure. But I would like to say that what we hear much less about are the successes. And there's been many, many successes. There's been millions of people saved from hunger, millions saved from malaria, HIV, AIDS. And I would say there's been many, many people who have been saved from these extremist ideologies through the tireless work that the agency has done over the past 2 decades. We just don't hear about them because they don't, they're not these major tragedies. These are the dogs that don't bark, right? So what's the consequence of all this? Um, I think what we're seeing now is we're going to run the counterfactual in real time. What's the world going to look like without this effort of US soft power? What's the world going to look like with US aid? I think it's very likely, and we're already seeing this, that human misery is going to spread. These drugs that have been successfully combating HIV/AIDS will no longer be available. We already heard about $500 million of U.S. food supplies spoiling in warehouses, people who aren't going to get this food. And it's in these conditions where societies are struggling, polities are struggling, where militant ideas are going to flourish. And I think the last thing, and I'll conclude with this, is that it's most likely that other powers are going to step in to fill the vacuum that America has left. So these are China, Russia, potentially Saudi Arabia. And I think, paradoxically, this idea of America first and, pursuing America first by cutting institutions like USAID may give our adversaries an unfair advantage in international relations and make things very difficult for the US going forward. I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thanks very much, Professor McGlinchey. I just want to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A function to post questions as we are discussing. And I want to remind my faculty colleagues to go to the bottom of your screen and hop into that Q&A and respond to questions if you are in a position to do so. All right, next up is Professor McGrath. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Professor Victor, for organizing this, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to be talking today about President Trump's actions regarding the federal workforce, many of whom are our friends and neighbors in the DC area, but most, in fact, I think it's about 80% of federal employees live and work across the country, not in the DC area. And they implement essential programs in disaster relief, veterans services, public health and infrastructure, and a whole lot more. So what happens to them is not just a DC issue, it affects communities nationwide. I'm going to start by putting recent personnel moves in the context of presidential powers more broadly. Then I'll explain why these efforts are especially celebrated on the right as a response to the so-called deep state. But in reality, much of what's happening may violate federal law and ignores the historical failures of the spoils system, a method of government staffing that the US abandoned more than a century ago. So first, I'll start with what Trump is doing that's quote unquote normal. Every president seeks to exert control over the federal bureaucracy. That's not new at all. Presidents appoint political allies, cabinet secretaries, agency heads, and key staff. They push out bureaucrats that they see as obstructing their agendas. And they try to reduce bureaucratic resistance and friction. Civil servants sometimes interpret policies differently or move too slowly or too deliberately for an administration's liking. But historically, presidents have focused on steering the bureaucracy through political appointees, not by targeting career civil servants. Trump's approach is different. Instead of just replacing top officials, he's seeking to remove career staff, people responsible for the day-to-day functioning of our government. This is a major break from the past, and I think an attempt to revive the spoils system. What is the spoils system? Well, before the civil service reforms of the late 19th century, government jobs were handed out as political rewards. To the victor go the spoils. Government workers owed their jobs to political loyalty, not to their own competence. And corruption was rampant. Officials were often unqualified and rewarded for their partisan service alone, rather than their expertise. Each incoming administration then fired massive numbers of employees and replaced them with their own supporters, leading to constant governmental disruptions. This system collapsed in 1881 when President James Garfield was assassinated by a job seeker who was angry that he hadn't received the patronage position that he thought that he deserved. In response, Congress passed the Pendleton Act in 1883, which created the merit-based system that we have today, where hiring is supposed to be based on qualifications and civil servants stay in their jobs regardless of who wins elections. Trump's effort to replace career officials with political hires is a direct attempt to undo these reforms and return to the unstable and corrupt practices of the spoils system. So why do conservatives think that this is a great idea? Well, for decades, conservatives have argued that the federal workforce is biased against Republicans and resistant to conservative policies. The term deep state reflects this belief that career officials undermine Republican administrations particularly. But the bureaucracy, to the extent that it leans left not because of biased hiring, but instead because of self-selection. Public service jobs attract people who believe in government's role in solving problems, which tends to correlate with those with moderate or liberal political views. Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to gravitate toward private sector careers, where market-based solutions are more emphasized. So while the bureaucracy may lean left, this isn't because hiring is rigged against conservatives. It's because conservatives largely choose not to apply for these jobs. Thus, there's no reason to believe that replacing career staff from the deep state with Republican and conservative political hires will make government any more effective. Instead, it will turn every future administration into a revolving door of mass firings and replacements, making governance impossible. Why this is likely illegal? Well, I'm not a lawyer, but the US Civil Service is protected by law to prevent political interference in most hiring and firing decisions. I mentioned the Pendleton Act before. This established that government jobs must be awarded based on merit and not loyalty. The Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 reinforced these protections, and courts have repeatedly ruled against presidents who try to politicize the rank-and-file civil service. Trump has already tried reclassifying thousands of civil servants as at-will employees, meaning that they could be fired without cause. His executive order from the first term, 13957, attempted this, but Biden rescinded it. This was the creation of Schedule F employment. Trump has since reinstated this and expanded the order, allowing for mass firings. If fully implemented, this would effectively nullify the Pendleton Act, which is perhaps a constitutional violation, given that it was passed by Congress and signed by the president in a previous period. Even if Trump's lawyers find loopholes, this would set a dangerous precedent for future presidents to fire and replace government workers at will. So this isn't just a legal issue, it's a threat to the stability of the government itself. The consequences are that I think this is a really bad idea. So even if Trump's plan survives these legal challenges, it creates chaos and weakens governance. In the short term, government operations are and will be disrupted. Mass firings create expertise gaps. There's also a lot of policy whiplash. Agencies won't be able to maintain long-term planning. And of course, there's the legal chaos. Lawsuits challenge mass firings, creating uncertainty. In the long term, what we should expect is a more partisan, unstable form of American government. Agencies will shift dramatically between administrations from different parties. Furthermore, there should be higher costs to government. Even though there might be fewer career civil servants, there will be more reliance on private contractors, who are more expensive and harder to hold accountable than their career civil servant counterparts. Finally, I just want to highlight that from sort of a neutral political science perspective, this doesn't really make sense for the Republican Party to pursue right now. If Democrats regain power, which they will at some point in the future, they'll use the same precedent to purge conservative appointees, leading to an endless cycle of hiring and firing, which is bad for the nation as a whole. Finally, the U.S. Civil Service was designed to be nonpartisan and stable. The spoils system, by contrast, leads to corruption, inefficiency, and political instability. Historically, spoils systems only lasted in eras of one political party dominance. But in today's highly competitive political environment, such a system is unsustainable and will likely feed into some of the comments of some of my colleagues. So I'm going to pass the torch now.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. McGrath, for that really useful context and historical lesson. Next up, we have Professor Burke. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Professor Victor. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Burke. I'm an assistant professor here at the Schar School, and I study issues around the politics and political theory of punishment. And what I want to talk about today is the convergence of crime control and immigration. So if we briefly survey the actions of the Trump administration on immigration, there's a lot to look at. Over the last few weeks, we've seen a declaration of national emergency at the border, which has allowed Trump to access federal funding and deploy U.S. military personnel without congressional approval. We've had a proclamation that the administration intends to deny birthright citizenship to babies born when neither parent has permanent legal status. Trump has also stipulated that federal officials take actions to ensure that sanctuary jurisdictions do not receive federal funding, and there are others. All these are important in their own right, but I want to focus on a trend that predates the second Trump presidency, but shows signs of intensifying. And that trend is the increasing convergence of criminal law and immigration, what's become known in a somewhat clunky term as crimmigration. So what do I mean by that? By crimmigration, I mean the merging of crime and immigration, the increasing use of criminal law and criminal legal institutions like police, jails, and prisons to achieve policy objectives related to immigration. Moreover, crimmigration entails a broader reframing of the immigration issue. It marks the abandonment of an older framing of non-citizens as contributing members of society on a path to full political membership, to use a famous phrase, as Americans in waiting, for an image of non-citizens as dangerous deviants and security risks. Migrants are people to be feared, their risks assessed, and the threat they pose managed. For the next 6 minutes or so, I aim to make a simple but urgent point. Crimmigration is transforming both immigration and criminal law, and not for the better. It's a policy trend that is both deeply flawed in practice and troubling in principle, or at least I'm going to try to convince you. So let's take a step back for a moment. I want to separate out two different thoughts. So the first is a simple thought that individuals have diverging preferences related to immigration. There are disagreements about the total volume of migrants that should be in the U.S. There's disagreement about which groups, if any, ought to be prioritized in immigration policy: refugees, talented individuals, family reunification, and so on. We might have varying tolerance for unauthorized border crossings. So some view unauthorized border crossings as a serious issue requiring strict enforcement, while others might see it as an unavoidable consequence of flawed legal pathways. And there are disagreements about the scope and shape of naturalization processes. And if I were to poll the people in this audience on these basic issues, I suspect our moral and political intuitions would vary wildly. Among the factors that lead to disagreement are differing moral intuitions about how to balance our obligations to those within our borders, to those that are outside of our borders. And to be clear, these are important debates and debates we need to hash out. And that's one set of issues, preferences related to immigration. But there's a second thought, and a thought that needs to be separated from that first one, that's a bit different. And it's the one I want to emphasize here. And it's about the appropriate regulatory mechanisms to respond to the immigration issue, whether you are, to simplify, an immigration maximalist or an immigration minimalist, or something in between. Unlike preferences about immigration levels, regulatory mechanisms are about how the system operates to enforce, process, or facilitate immigration laws. And there are a number of options. We can have administrative and civil regulation. There are market-based approaches. There are foreign policy and development-based approaches, like Professor McGlinchey just mentioned. And there is a host of others. As I mentioned initially, one regulatory approach seems to be swallowing up all of the others and has become synonymous with the current administration. And that approach is crimmigration. So I mentioned earlier that crimmigration is the merging of crime control and immigration, but let me be a little bit more precise. So crimmigration entails the two interwoven processes. So first, its immigration policy increasingly uses the securitized approach of criminal law to achieve its ends. So for example, unauthorized border crossings, which were historically a civil offense, are increasingly treated like serious crimes, leading to more arrests, prosecutions, and incarceration. And then on the other hand, the second, criminal investigations into crime related to immigration borrow some of the more lax standards from civil immigration law. So criminal law in the US traditionally has strong due process protections like the right to legal representation, strict standards of evidence, and so on. But authorities now are often using weaker standards from civil immigration law that have lower evidentiary thresholds and often proceedings that lack legal representation. And so just to take one example from the last few weeks, consider the Lake and Riley Act. This was the first piece of legislation passed by the new Congress and signed by Trump. Among other provisions, the act mandates the federal detention without bail of migrants who are merely arrested for any theft-related crimes with no provision to free them if charges are later dropped. So to be clear, these kinds of policies are not new. You can find them in the Bush, Obama, and Biden presidencies. However, all signs point to an acceleration in the second Trump administration. In addition to the Lake and Riley Act, which I just mentioned, we've seen various other executive actions, which we can sort of talk about later. So why should you care about the amplification of this trend? After all, you might be thinking to yourself, Chris, geez, it's illegal immigration after all. Why isn't criminal law appropriate? Well, the first set of worries are pragmatic. Immigration policies are based on a theory of human behavior that doesn't seem to mesh well with what we know about the push and pull of immigration, which is a global phenomenon largely driven by economic need, political instability, and humanitarian crises. But there's another set of worries, one that get a lot less attention, and so that's where I want to spend my remaining time. And these are normative worries about an erosion of the rule of law and values around just punishment. The first of those worries is that crimmigration presents a threat to values associated with the rule of law. It erodes the distinction between civil and criminal law, creating a tiered system where migrants are punished without the full rights of criminal defendants, but are subject to indefinite detention, expedited deportation, and legal processes where due process protections are weak or non-existent. Likewise, I see crimmigration as a kind of moral mismatch. The wrong of unauthorized crossing of a border seems different in kind from the kinds of harm that typically justify criminal prosecution, incarceration, or prolonged detention. We generally reserve the criminal law's harshest penalties for actions that cause direct intentional harm, things like theft and assault and fraud, not for administrative or regulatory violations. When a traveler overstays a visa or crosses a border without authorization, it might violate immigration law, but does it warrant the same punitive measures as violent crimes? Crimmigration policies collapse these distinctions, treating migration itself as an act of inherent criminality rather than as a response to structural forces. This mismatch between the nature of the offense and the severity of the response is why the image of detention centers, family separations, and expedited removals provoke such deep moral unease. So I'll end with this basic question. If our goal is to control or stabilize or even deter at the border, we should ask ourselves whether criminal law, one of the bluntest tools that is available to us, is the right one for the task. And so with that, thanks.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Professor Burke. Next up is Dr. Miller.
Great. Thank you, Professor Victor, and thank you for all the my fellow members of the panel. This is really fascinating, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get to think about what's going on, which is the way I've been kind of thinking about it as the category of the panel, which isn't quite the name of the panel. I kind of phrased it into Marvin Gaye's 1971 hit, What's Going On, which for some reason keeps kind of coming back to me as I was thinking about this. I think the question, at least in our phrasing, perhaps not in Marvin's, suggests that there is a mystery to Trump's governance and rhetoric, that there's a mystery to what he is doing. Conceiving of this as a mystery, I suspect, operates on the assumption that if we expose the lies or the actions, people will come to their senses. That is, if we can just explain what he's doing, that will matter, and that will change the direction. And I do think that's true to an extent. But I also think most of that's already out there. I mean, most of us know what's going on. And it's a question then of the response to that, and a question of like how that response is being managed and stimulated and orchestrated. Things like the opening of Guantanamo as a concentration camp for the deportation of immigrants, the destruction of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, the attack on transgender, the sidelining of elected and appointed government officials by a private individual. These are all acts to strengthen the executive over a range of bodies. And again, I think that's sort of apparent, but I think that what we then might want to pay attention to is the enjoyment that people are having with that. The enjoyments both in the sense of actual enjoyment, but also the kind of emotional engagement that's working across a variety of political orientations. We all know what's going on, I think, but that isn't the entire point. Crucial to this action is the emotional stimulation. Like any good game show host, Trump knows how to keep an audience stimulated. It isn't exactly the facts we know, it's also the emotional stimulation we enjoy or resent. Trump's strategy of floating ridiculous ideas, annexing Canada or turning Gaza into a resort that he could own, provoke outrage among some, but also intensify an amusement among others. And in both cases, this is kind of a register of affective or emotional enjoyment, which we often treat as individual. And I would want kind of invite us to think of it as somewhat shared emotional experience, where many of us feel the need to critically respond, which adds to the humor. The sort of, I mean, that's sort of one of the traps that kind of operates here is Trump floats something kind of ridiculous. I feel like I have to respond to it with a straight face. That triggers a kind of enjoyment of the lib who's been triggered. Again, it's easy to sort of see the enjoyment and resentment of that dynamic. But of course, many now begin to imagine, you know, he floats Canada as taking over Canada as a kind of ridiculous thing. It's vaguely humorous. A few people respond. They're mocked for taking it seriously, but now it's an actual serious thing on the horizon, and people begin to imagine how glorious it would be to take over Canada. And Trump here is kind of engaged in this political, emotional playing field where he's manipulating a kind of emotional responses. Crucial to this political project is the emotional response of the public to his performance, from the outrage to the triggering to the despair. Which is to say that those, and you know, so that starting from that, the question now becomes for me, like, how do I respond to that in a world where I would like, in a world where my goals are perhaps a more democratic world, and a world in which I think outlining the lies and illegalities isn't really going to stop what's going on. I think it's important for us as citizens to think about these affective and emotional dynamics that Trump operates under, as he operates in our enjoyments of actions and behaviors of other people. He isn't just in control of them, and it's one thing to think about in terms of responding and engaging with him are the places where this gets intensified across a range of modalities. Fox News, evangelical churches, techies online, all of these serve to kind of reinforce each other, but they also kind of stand as places to engage and kind of critically respond. But also, I think more importantly in some ways and more difficultly, try to change the kind of tone or affective register under which this is playing. One of the, and I think and I find that kind of hard to think about, like I'm not sure how to do that. But one place that I sort of start to get a grip on some of this is to think about the ways that a lot of the, I don't know, the affective song that Trump plays is notes around conceptual intellectual confusion, particularly those that have kind of come up in the last, several generations around categories that affect the body and the reality of our categories of knowledge. He cultivates, I think, and intensifies assurances and resistances to the failure of identities to be fully closed and stable, whether those are national identities, racial identities, biological identities. This is the place that Trump, again, I kind of think we all know these are not entirely stable, but one of the appeals Trump offers, I think, is the desire to make them, to sort of solidify them to some extent. And this is an authoritarian response to this lack of closure. He calls out the fractures in these categories and then promises a solution based in sovereign power. So this operates to sort of stir up the confusions that are there in our categories of sex and gender and race and nationality. And then he kind of acts to intensify, produce a solution that helps to intensify a kind of the role of sovereign power in deciding that decision, if you will. So if you're confused, so if you're tired of the complexities of gender and sex, Trump kind of calls out, he will sign an act assuring that only girls play sports as girls, here affirming a kind of, historically older notion of sex as kind of built into the body in a particular way. If you're confused by drag shows, Trump will take over the Kennedy Center. If you're tired of the idea of American having non-white meanings, Trump will sign an act to create concentration camps for people in this geographic region who are not officially recognized as belonging, even if they are legally here as refugees. Moreover, he will reject birthright citizenship for children of undocumented immigrants, such as is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Again, if your idea of nationalism is actually contestable, Trump promises a kind of solution, and that solution intensifies a kind of sovereign power to act the solution. If you're tired of the complexity of political groupings being identified with geographical frameworks, shut down the USAID. If you're tired of paper straws, Trump will sign an act banning them. Plastic straws, and on the one hand, that's sort of ridiculous. Again, the kind of comic way he wants to operate. You do something comically, people respond in a serious manner, and they're made to look foolish. He can then kind of occupy that space. But here we already kind of know that what's going on there is a response to climate change. It's Trump's response to the climate and to the very conception that humans are part of the climate. I mean, here's a place where he imagines a kind of human who can act singularly on a planet, and the planet does not act back on them. Again, an idea that's become very difficult to manage among scientists, I think. So again, I think it kind of works like that, but I wouldn't say that part of the dynamic of you intensify the problematics of these intellectual categories, and then is only useful in producing a kind of sovereign power that will then act to regulate it. I think the sovereign power, of course, has its own sets of enjoyments. That people enjoy the strong man kind of coming in and doing this is certainly part of this. They sort of enjoy those moments. So again, in this sense, to kind of the place I would like to conclude here is to suggest and kind of highlight that sense, like, I think if there's a desire to respond, that response needs to be very attentive to this kind of affective play that's going on. And I think that that's sort of in the kind of Marvin Gaye line of many of us also know we've got to find a way. I suspect that a different defense of democracy at this moment requires a defense of the complexity of our categories of knowledge, identities, and even life and the planet. It requires a set of enthusiasms and enjoyments in the messy perplexity of life, an enthusiastic embrace of the ways that categories of knowledge of life never fully contain us. Even if conceiving of life as singular and orderly often shifts power to the sovereign who can attempt to make it so, an enthusiasm for the messiness of categories of life, sex, nation, race, might shift us away from at least that mode of consolidation of power. It offers a way to engage the affective field on which Trump plays. More directly, I think that means we have to we have to stand our ground in a variety of locations, our workplaces, our places of worship, our school, and with other protesters. One of the elements of this political crisis is the feeling that our institutions are not automatically going to stop it, that we will have to do it ourselves, standing together in spite of many differences, as many have already done, and standing there with problematic and perplexing selves. More specifically, I think we might need to meet, as Marvin Gaye suggests, on picket lines and picket signs. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Professor Miller. And bringing up the anchor leg of this amazing relay here, we have Professor Pearlstein.
Well, thank you, Professor Victor. I don't have any musical analogies to make. My musical taste ended with James Taylor, but I see this constitutional crisis as really in the context of and as an outgrowth of what is now almost 30 years of congressional dysfunction, Congress being unable to do its job. Let's start with the fact that Congress's failure to resolve and create consensus around a number of problems, immigration, the budget, trade, climate, you name it, led to a situation where frustrated voters were ready to elect a strong man who promised to cut through the bureaucracy, cut through the special interests and the political gridlock and get something done. Congress is also implicated in that having failed to resolve those issues for such a long time, they invited or in some cases forced, the courts and the president to act instead, to fill the vacuum. And as a result, they dramatically reduced their own role and the importance of their institution. And in time, there was a widespread expectation among voters, among the other branches of government, even among the members of Congress themselves, that on almost every issue, Congress would be unable to act. And now that has really become a very self-fulfilling expectation. But I think the most interesting thing, and I've been sort of studying this for the last 2 years, is that members have lost any sense of personal responsibility for governing the country. What little that was done over the last 25 years was largely negotiated behind closed doors by presidents and party leaders as members of Congress, members of the House and Senate, got socialized to believe that their job was simply to vote the party line, mouth the party talking points, and raise money for the next election. So now, when suddenly we have this president who sends up patently unqualified nominees to be confirmed by the Senate, we have a president who boastfully asserts the power to ignore the laws that Congress has passed, who shuts down agencies that Congress created, who fires officials who had been confirmed for fixed terms by Congress, and a president who refuses to spend the money that Congress appropriated. Rank and file Republicans in the Republican majority in the House and Senate have become so unaccustomed to making independent decisions and taking responsibility for, governing outcomes. They've become so accustomed to following orders of party leaders, and they've convinced themselves that they have to maintain party unity in order for their party and themselves to win the next election. And so they sort of reflexively just go along and find a way to rationalize it to the voters and, frankly, to themselves. It would only take a few Republican defections in our closely divided House and Senate to slow down the Trump steamroller. But so far, there have been almost no dissents. Now, I know many of you who are listening to this think this is a Republican problem, that Democrats would not fall into this trap. And we have to admit there's no question that Republicans are more responsible for the partisanship and the gridlock in Congress. It started on their watch. But I'd ask you to remember that Democrats in Congress did not protest when their president tried to forgive tens of billions of dollars in student debt in a move that was clearly illegal. They did not hold any oversight hearings when they were in the majority on the fiasco in Afghanistan or the crisis on the border. When they were in charge, they did nothing to address unsustainable budget deficits. They made them worse. They said nothing when a president who was elected because he wasn't Bernie Sanders, because he wasn't Elizabeth Warren, started governing as if he were. And let's remember that they were silent when this president, Joe Biden, insisted on running for re-election when he was clearly not up to the job, and they knew it. So this is not just a Republican problem. It's a congressional problem. And in the end of the day, it will require Congress to resolve the constitutional crisis. We can't just rely on the courts for that.
Terrific reminders. Thank you very much, Steve. And that brings us to about 4 o'clock. I want to thank my colleagues. I did not have to use any mechanisms of authoritarian control to keep people on time. You all did a great job. I think perhaps I am the one that maybe went the most overtime setting everything up. But I'm going to dispense with trying to facilitate conversation among us because we do have quite a bit of activity going on in the Q&A, and we have a pretty large audience here, and I'm sensing that maybe there's the desire for some engagement here. So I'm going to go ahead and invite people to either raise your hand and be called on to turn on your mic so you can ask a question verbally. Or I'm going to also continue to take questions from the Q&A that we will answer verbally. We've got 15 answered questions in the Q&A, so thank you to my colleagues that are diligently working on those as we're moving along here. But a number of unanswered questions still there, so we'll go ahead and begin to take some questions. I'm going to go ahead and call on Ryan Schrum first. Please turn on your mic and your camera if you are able.
Yeah, my mic isn't working for this computer for some reason. But I had a question about the budget deficit. So we all recognize that it's obviously very important about the growing deficit and just the debt in general. But I think that in my opinion, why should politicians care about trying to address the debt or deficit when there's not really any electoral reward for doing so? Um, Voters don't really, they like to think that they care about the debt, but when it comes to, raising taxes or cutting spending, they don't really want to do that. Republicans really want to cut taxes, but they don't want to cut spending, which is kind of hard to advance your cautions about the deficit in those situations. So I don't really think it's a sustainable thing to. Yeah, hopefully you guys get what I'm trying to say, but it's just not very. I don't know what needs to happen to politicians actually start acting about the budget.
Thanks. I'm going to let Steve jump in here.
Well, it's a good question, Ryan. I could say a couple of things. First of all, people, the argument is always made, well, if politicians don't have an incentive to do the right thing, then they won't do it. Ryan, I don't have an incentive not to give you a fair amount of reading. I don't have an incentive not to go along with great inflation. I don't have an incentive to make you talk up in class when you don't want to. But I do those things as a professor because it's my job and it's the right thing to do. So first of all, the notion that their actions can be nothing more than the sum of the incentives in the system that we set them up. Actually, that's a very economist kind of notion. The reality is we have jobs to do and they have jobs to do. And if they don't want to do it, then don't run for the office. The second thing I would say is at some point, the deficit is a tough problem because you never know when it's going to become a problem. And look, the deficit, we've had uncontrolled deficits now for 25 years. But at some point, the United States is not going to be able to borrow money. And there's going to be a financial crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And anyone who's in office when that happens, guess what? They'll get thrown out of office. So there is a little bit of self-interest even in beginning to address this problem. And the way you, as a politician, you do that is you have to educate the public. That's part of their job, and they've given up that job of education, which is too bad. Because if they would do it and they get better at it, they've gotten out of the practice, then they would be able to do these things in a way that wasn't so costly for them personally, politically.
Yeah, I would add that if you look at times in U.S. history and legislative history when Congress has really taken action on things like debt and deficit or other types of fiscal crises, they do it when there's an emergency, right? That it's not electorally feasible to engage in those policymaking functions until it is. And when you've got the Social Security Administration about to go bust, as it did in the early 80s, or you've got financial meltdown like we saw in 2008, or other crises that come on, then you can see the legislature spring into action under that kind of duress situation. But I agree with Steve, they really do not have incentives to take long-term electoral incentives, at least to take long-term action. I'm going to invite my colleagues here on the panel to hop into the Q&A, and if you read an answer there that you would like to respond verbally, then please check the Answer Live button, and I'm going to put you in the queue here to take some of these questions live. I've marked a couple of them myself. And in the effort to go back and forth between the written questions and the hand-raised questions, I'm going to go ahead and take Kristen Height's question next. Her question is, what sense do you have that the Trump versus United States ruling, which was last year regarding presidential immunity, are being broadly applied to justify or support executive orders that conflict with laws? And if so, what recourse can be used to preserve the integrity of any structure or law? Is there a broad precedent, or will each issue need to be handled brick by brick? So my sort of quick hot take on that question is that court decision, Trump versus the United States, which I believe was it just last year or 2 years ago? Time is a blur. Was really profound. Essentially, we have a Supreme Court decision saying that presidents can't be charged, they can't be prosecuted, and the appropriate recourse, according to the Constitution, this is what the Supreme Court reaffirmed. When the president does illegal or inappropriate or extra constitutional things, the appropriate recourse is for the Congress to impeach the president. The problem with that is it doesn't work. We've never actually removed a president from office using that constitutional system. And the main reason for that has to do with partisan polarization. And so under times of polarization, that particular check from the legislature to the executive branch doesn't work, because the legislators get more invested in their partisan oriented obligations than their branch or congressional oriented obligations, because that's where their political incentives lie. And so that's just problematic. It's a way in which the way our politics are organized by parties do not match with the way the Constitution organizes the checks and balances. So it's just a mismatch between how the politics works and how it's set up. So does it need to be handled brick by brick? Probably. But that every brick, so to speak, every court case that comes forward that says, puts a restraining order or whatever, or says that something can't go forward because it was done inappropriately, every one of those is another potential test to see whether or not the executive will comply. And every time it doesn't comply, it further erodes the constitutional order. And so that's a sort of a drip of erosion that we may see. But to underscore the point that Steve said earlier, it's, ultimately this can't just be on the courts. Ultimately, you're going to need the legislative branch to play its policy-making role and its check role on the executive branch. Anybody else want to hop in on that one, or I'm going to move to Xavier?
And it's the absence of the threat of impeachment that is almost more important than actually impeaching someone. I mean, at this point, it may be necessary to successfully impeach someone to establish the credibility of the threat of impeachment. But if the threat of impeachment were there, if somehow a president believed that when push comes to shove, members of his own party would vote to convict and impeach and convict if he really stepped over the line, that probably would be enough to restrain. I don't think this president actually believes that, and so there is no credibility to the threat.
Great, thank you. Next in the queue is, and before I call on him, Xavier, you're next, but I want to remind folks that the panelists aren't paying attention to the chat, we're paying attention to the Q&A, and they can either provide written responses to the Q&A or tag a question to be answered verbally in the Q&A, which I invite my colleagues to jump in there, and I invite the audience to use the Q&A. I have no idea what's going on in the chat, so hopefully it's all candy and roses over there. Xavier, you're on, go ahead.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate the conversation. It's very fruitful about these times. My question is more so about, with the shutting of USAID, do you think that this second administration is going to, like, I guess, have more so of a, I guess, the second, Trump administration's foreign policy will be more so, I guess, more so based on like coercive power, or like, based on threats of like military force or economic force in order to achieve goals? Or do you think there'll still be like some room for cooperation, or is that like the current strategy that we are seeing playing out now?
Eric?
Oh, yeah, great question, Xavier. I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, I think one thing that we know about Trump, and I remember, I grew up in New York, and he was, long before he was a big figure across the country, he was a big figure as a kid growing up in New York. I mean, one thing that I saw growing up, and I think we see today, is he's very transactional. So I can anticipate him pursuing a lot of bilateral negotiations with different kinds of countries, rather than necessarily turning to, say, military hard power. My sense is he has an aversion actually for military solutions and is much more about the bilateral. But he wants to be in control of that, and he doesn't see soft power exercised through an institution like USAID as something that he's in control of. He wants to be at the seat making. We see this with Gaza right now, right? It actually gets to some of the stuff that Sarah's been talking about, and the excesses. He uses the excesses and the very kind of outlandish nature of these demands, and then walks them back and uses these as bargaining techniques. So it's going to be, it's not going to be a hard power military, I don't think, and I hope not. But I do think it's going to be much more of these actions that we've seen with Mexico and Canada and China, these more bilateral discussions where he tries to bully, rather than entice through soft power. I'd be curious to hear what other folk have to say.
All right, hearing no one else jump in there, I'm going to go back to the chat. Thank you for that question, Xavier. Rayan Vatanpour writes, in my lifetime, I've noticed the polarization of political parties after the first Trump administration, where there is less mutual agreement on topics and policies on both sides of the aisle and more hostility between Republicans and Democrats, where understanding of others' beliefs happens less. Of course, this is just my personal opinion, but do you think this polarization of parties and lessened acceptance of other parties' beliefs will continue to worsen after the Trump administration's second term? And would you say my observation is correct? So I've done a little bit of work and a lot of reading and teaching in this area. And I would say that, yes, absolutely, your observation is correct in terms of polarization. But the roots of partisan polarization in the United States are pretty deep. By my reading of the literature, they go back to the 1970s and are rooted in changes in the way the political parties reorganized after the Civil Rights Movement. They're rooted in the way that we responded to the Watergate crisis and changed some federal laws related to campaign finance, and other executive regulatory functions, and also very strongly related to changes to tax law that put into place the conditions that have created really significant economic and wealth inequality in the United States. And the relationship between wealth and economic inequality and partisan polarization is really strong. Scholars don't have a terrific understanding of exactly what the causal mechanisms are there, but we know that when societies start to see significant economic inequality, the way that we have in the United States now, it often leads to various forms of political distress and regime destabilization. And so I would say what you observe is correct, but you can't pin it back just on 2016 or something like that. Like, it goes back to the 1970s. It's been building a long time, and it's been a slow erosion of political parties that have very slowly, and I'm looking at Newt Gingrich now in the 90s, and some things that Clinton did and so forth, that have where the parties began to not follow not just the rule of law kind of stuff, but the norms of mutual toleration, the norms of letting the other side have power when they win power. And those two norms about mutual toleration, allowing your political opponents to compete and hold power, have just gotten really eroded over time. And it's that erosion of the norms that ultimately leads to the erosion of the institutions. And so this has been a very slow buildup that political scientists have been talking about for well over a decade now. And what we're seeing in the current constitutional crisis is really, in my mind, just the consequence of all of that. Rob, you look like maybe you wanted to jump in there, or are you writing something else? Okay, anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay. And back to the hands. Jonathan, you are next. Please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Victor. It's nice to see you again. I think my question is maybe simple and maybe a little bit repetitive, but as someone that cares a lot about mental health and also about like government and its place in our lives, one thing that I have a question for everybody on the panel is, what do you see, I guess, as your role as your present role in the Schar School as a professor, teacher, educator? What do you see as your role going forward in yeah, I guess how do you see yourself going forward in terms of like making sure to take care of your mental health, but also like being able to, continue with like the job responsibilities that you have, and I guess trying to continue educating the youth, which is really important, about how government works and what its place is in our lives. Thank you.
That's a terrific question. I really like that. Others may want to jump in here, but I'll provide my version of the answer to that. So I've got three things for you. That's my recipe to what do you literally do to manage yourself through these sort of moments of crisis. So my three things are limits, nature, and connections. So first, on limits, you have to stay informed. It's important to know what's going on and have some context for what's happening, but putting some limits on it so you don't feel like you yourself are in a constant state of panic, in thinking about the means and the timing and the methods by which you are consuming news and talking about it, so that when things can trigger that sort of fight or flight acute response in the brain, it can cause us to hyper focus on things that produce a lot of anxiety. And so while some anxiety is perhaps warranted, it's not particularly healthy. And so finding ways to limit the way that you consume those things, I think, is useful. Number two is nature. Like, honestly, like, touch grass. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that doing physical activity, being outside, doing something that involves something broader than yourself, out in the real world, so to speak, in the natural world, is just really important for mental health. Making healthy choices about how we take care of our bodies, in that sense, I think, is really important. And then my number three thing is connections. So I'm a network scholar, and the way that I understand politics is through the series of connections that we all make with one another. But it's also going to ultimately explain what determines how the U.S. Reforms itself going forward, or gets stuck in this semi-authoritarian system for a while, which is building local community, engaging in local civic society through organizations that work on, acts of generosity, acts of gratitude, acts of, giving to others in ways that embolden communities or build relationships or advance people's rights or advocate for others, or whatever it is. Various acts of service that come in a variety of forms in our really robust civic society in the United States is, I'm quite confident, going to be a big part of the answer as to what helps us claw our way back to a more democratic system. Anybody else want to jump in on Jonathan's question?
I guess I can say something simple about that. It is often like drinking from a fire hose, to use an old expression, but I think that in the face of just constant onslaughts of information, sometimes you have to pick a lane. There's a set of issues that motivate you that maybe don't capture sort of everything that's sort of going on. I think that sense of being overwhelmed can be mitigated by picking an issue that matters to you and following it really deeply and trying to contribute, even if it's, a really narrow slice. And so I know that in times in which our attention is being torn among 1,000 things, yeah, picking a specific lane in which you can make even a small little contribution is probably the easiest way, at least for me, to kind of sort through it.
All right, I'm going to move next to back to the Q&A, where Lillian Mullins writes, as we have seen with the massive discrepancies on both sides, do you think that there will be or maybe should be a change to the Constitution and the way the US government works to avoid seeing a president be able to bypass laws and regulations the way we've seen? Is this something that is necessary or something that we may see in the future? I don't know, Lillian, I gotta say, yes, no, maybe. It's hard to say. In a lot of ways, I think the institutions don't fit the politics, as I was sort of explaining a few minutes ago. But the only ways to change the Constitution are to either hold a constitutional convention or piecemeal amend things. But we live in such a partisan, polarized society that I don't really see a viable path for either of those options realistically right now. In a perfect world, I have a whole different constitution in mind that I would write. There are some scholars out there that have some pretty creative ideas about ways to reform the electoral system in the United States that would ultimately create something closer to almost a parliamentary style, a system that would wind up generating multi-partyism that might improve representation, but it could also create more dysfunction. And you wouldn't need actually a change to the Constitution in order to do that, because somehow we didn't write parties and voting in elections into the Constitution. So there are some big things that we could do that could have a big effect on things like polarization and institutions without actually changing the Constitution. And so I think something along those lines, or big laws that affect things like income inequality or whatnot, I think are probably more likely, or at least in my dreamland, that's the more hopeful way of trying to progress things forward from there. All right, next I'm going to go back to unless anybody else want to hop in on constitutional dreams. All right, back to the hand raising. Mike Condrey, you're up. You need to unmute yourself.
We still can't hear you, Mike. No, I think you got an input problem, which is
Yeah.
because I think Mike would have a good answer to the constitutional question just posed.
All right, we're going to let you troubleshoot your tech problem and maybe come back to you. Noah, you're the next raised hand, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Hutch. So my question is, what role has social media played in the degradation of American democratic norms, and what norms and arms? That's my question.
There's some terrific literature on this these days. One of the books that I like is by Jamie Settle, who's a political scientist down at William and Mary. And she got a bunch of Facebook data, and Facebook is a little passé now, and so this might be dated at this point. But her research is still relevant in that it shows that when social media platforms are set up with particular types of characteristics that encourage kind of discourse along particular lines, it does facilitate sort of polarizing and extremist views in a population. My general reading of things in this literature suggests that social media has been a contributing factor to extremism and polarization, but not a direct causal factor. What would the US look like had we not had some of the institutional polarizing things that happened and we lived in a social media world? I don't know. We don't live in that world. So I would say social media made it worse, but it didn't start the fire.
I would say
Very much.
I'm unfamiliar with all the literature, Noah, but I would say it has had a huge impact. And you just have to look at the amount of time that Donald Trump and Elon Musk spend on social media, and you would you could infer, I think, the degree to which they think it's important. And right now, they've been pretty successful in getting to where they are. I'll tell you another little story. 2 years ago, when the House was electing a new speaker and they had to go 15 rounds, all the members of the Congress had to sort of be in the chamber for hours and hours and hours. They just sort of hung around because they had to keep taking votes. And I was sitting up in the gallery, press gallery, and looking down. And at any moment in time, I can tell you that 2/3 of them were looking at their telephone. Now, here they had an opportunity. They were newly elected. Many of them were new. They had an opportunity to meet each other and talk to each other. There's certainly plenty to talk about at that moment. And 2/3 of them were looking at their phones. They have become very afraid of social media mobs who attack them, who attack their family and their staff. And even though that only may be 5 or 10,000 people, those 5 or 10,000 people have inordinate influence over their behavior and their fears. So I would say the answer to your question is a huge impact.
All right, we've only got 5 minutes left and we still have a lot of questions. I can see we're not going to get to answering all of them. I'm going to hand things back to Mike Condrey and hopefully he got his tech issues fixed and can ask his question. We're going to try to do rapid fire here. So go ahead, Mike.
Okay, first important question. Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
Okay. This kind of basically my question is, how do we punch through what I call the "it can't happen here, politics is normal, both sides" mindset? Because we had Professor Victor outline at the beginning how this is how it's not normal. But again, even in the course of discussion, we had Professor McGrath saying, why would Republicans basically allow Democrats to have this kind of power? It's like MAGA has no intention of ever giving up power. They don't accept anybody else in power as legitimate. They've made that quite clear, and they've empowered a set of goon squad, basically with the Proud Boys, et cetera, to attack future elections if they don't like the results. So, if we drop back into the both sides same or it can't happen here mentality, how do we call out what is specifically happening in a clear way?
I'll jump in since nobody else is turning on their mic, but I would say it's really hard because any instance, this whole event notwithstanding is actually a terrific instance of it. It's really hard to just make a plain statement about exactly what's happening and not sound like you're being a partisan, right? Because it is not normal for an executive to be doing the things that the executive doing. I'm not saying that because I'm anti-Republican. I'm saying that because I'm pro-democratic institutions, and this goes against the republic, the democratic order in the Constitution. The fact that we use these same words for parties and institutions sometimes gets confusing. So you have to just very plainly continue to call a spade and continue to call out the ways in which this isn't just policy. This isn't just Republicans and Democrats disagreeing on how to make government more efficient. This is not Al Gore's 1990 commission, right? This is the executive trampling all over and doing whatever they want in order to consolidate power and change the regime, the order in the United States. And that's what we have to just continue to talk about to help folks get. Steve, did you want to jump in on that?
We hold events like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has gone quite well, so I suspect we'll do more. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Just one more thing, in addition to all the things that you said, Jen, I think also it would help if the Democrats actually had a message, right? And it's one thing to scream about what the president is currently doing, and we can all question the executive overreach, but until the other party can articulate a message that resonates with the public more broadly, it's going to be very difficult to stop. You can't fight a clear message with a muddied message, and that's what's currently going on, I think, in our political system, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's taken the Democrats a while to get organized. Rob, you were going to answer the next question live. You want to do it in 60 seconds? Can I challenge you? Has the 1974 Impoundment Control Act ever been tested in judicial review? Are we headed there now? And what are the chances the Supreme Court could invalidate it as an improper intrusion into the president's authority?
I don't think so. So I chose to answer this because I've researched it for lecture for undergrads. I don't think it's been challenged constitutionally. It has been interpreted statutorily a few times in favor of the Impoundment Control Act. So basically telling Nixon to listen to the law sort of thing. I doubt that it's going to be, so like one thing that might be a hot take, I doubt that it's going to actually be challenged in the Supreme Court anytime soon, because that would require Congress to assert the fact that it passed this law and that the president has to follow the law, which isn't happening right now. So I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to proactively address the issue unless Congress itself complains about the violation.
I don't know about that, Rob. I would think that the private citizen who is aggrieved by the fact that the president is not spending money for appropriated purposes that from which he or she might benefit has standing, and I would think it would be very hard for the court to ignore that suit.
I think that, I mean, like they would have standing, but would the court grant certiorari, or would they hide behind this being a political question? They have precedent.
No, I know they have in the past, but I don't think in the current environment they could do that. I think it's headed right in that direction.
Hopefully that answer was clear to whoever asked.
All right, we are at 4:30, and I did not tell my panelists I was going to do this. I'm about to spring something on them. But in order to tie things up here, first, I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank Amberly Page and Shannon Williams for the logistical support, and the Schar School for their financial support for this program. I want to thank everybody who attended. We had 130 people, I think, at our peak here. Apologies to the people whose questions did not get answered. We'll have to come back to you at some point or hold more events like this in the future. So on the way out here, the final question for each of you. Eric, it's coming to you first. I'm going to go in the same order as before. One word, this can be a word of advice or a word of caution or a word of whatever, or one book that you recommend that you want to encourage the audience to read. So a word or a book. Eric, go.
Discourse, and then let me follow up with two more. Talk to people you disagree with, because they'll seem less like the enemy if you actually have a conversation with them.
Terrific. Thanks. Rob.
What are you, Ezra Klein here, Jen?
Totally.
This is crazy. I would say endurance is the word. So show some endurance.
Terrific. Thanks, Burke.
Also, just an essay that I suggested to the Democracy Lab students a couple weeks ago, which is an essay by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit.
Terrific one. Thank you so much. Char.
Just to play off Eric, maybe argue with them a bit, though. Talk to them, but be prepared to disagree.
Thank you. And Steve.
Get angry.
Get angry.
And do something about it.
All right. With gratitude to everybody for your participation, thank you so much. We're going to end the program here. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.